Okay, in this one we're going to talk about some problems with logical positivism, right? So last video we looked at logical positivism as a method of doing science, or at least of understanding what's going on in the sciences, right? They said, again, there's two types of truths in the world. There's analytic and synthetic. The analytic truths are true by definition, right? So if you're careful about what your language means, you'll find out that a lot of things are analytic, and then you can just know them by doing logic, and they're either true or false by definition. And then you get a bunch of other sentences that are synthetic truths, right? They make statements about the way the world is, and those statements are true but on the basis of the verification conditions, which turns out to be on the basis of some observation of the world, right? And so our logical positivists said, hey, look, that's how we're doing science. That's how we're getting knowledge of the world. What's wrong with this theory? Why is this not a good way to think about knowledge if it's not a good way? And why is it a bad model of science? We're going to look at two objections. First objection, the verification principle itself is notoriously difficult to formulate, and it's virtually impossible to formulate in a way that's not applying to theories that the logical positivists were trying to show we're trying to reject, right? A lot of ways you could formulate their verification principle would apply equally to Hegel's absolute idealism, or if you remember from in class, right? That those were their arch nemesis, right? That was something they absolutely didn't want to be the case. So if they formalize the principle, they say this is what we're actually talking about, and it applies to the people that they radically disagree with, well, that's bad, right? They have to have some way to formally distinguish their approach from other people's approaches, and it was notoriously difficult to do that in practice. The other problem is most of the ways you would formulate the verification principle made it self-defeating, right? So think about it. If you're a logical positivist, you say anything true about the world is either true by definition, it's an analytic truth, or it's a synthetic truth where it's true on the basis of an observation. Well, think about that. I'm a logical positivist. I just gave you my method for determining truth. Is that true? Is it an analytic truth that's how we discover truth? Well, no, right? Not obviously. There's nothing about the nature of statements about the world that would suggest that the logical positivist verification principle itself is an analytic truth. It is not something that is true by definition. So it can't be an analytic truth. So it would have to be a synthetic truth, or it would have to be nonsense, right? That was the other option. Is it a synthetic truth? Well, what observation of the world would tell us that the logical positivist verification principle is true? It's a claim about the method for discovering truth. There's no experiment you could run. There's nothing you could observe out there in the world that would demonstrate that that principle is true or false, right? So it's not a synthetic truth either. So the logical positivist verification principle looks like it's self-defeating. It looks like it is nonsense on its own, just following its own rules. And so that was a huge problem for the logical positivists. It still is if you want to be a logical positivist, is how do you formulate the verification principle in a way that's not self-defeating? And that seemed and does seem basically impossible to do. So that was a huge problem they ran into. If it's self-defeating, that can't be the method of the sciences, right? That can't be the method for discovering truth. So that's a big deal. Second problem they run into is holism. So Quine, we'll talk really quickly about him as well. Quine comes out with a challenge that potentially is fatal for the positivists. So who was Quine? Quine's a philosopher. Definitely don't have time to talk through him. Among the many things he does, he writes this paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. It's arguably one of the most important philosophical works of the 20th century. And in this article, he argues for a holistic approach to knowledge, right? What he's saying is that we can only test statements or propositions holistically. The only way to know whether or not a sentence is true or false is within a holistic context. And if that's correct, and he gives really powerful arguments for thinking that it is correct, then it would turn out that the positivist approach to understanding empiricism and the positivist approach to understanding the scientific method is fatally flawed. So, what on earth am I talking about? What the holist says is you can't understand really anything without looking at its place in a larger whole. Take any concept, any idea, like any statement you want to make about the world, it can only really be understood, the holist says, within a context. You can't isolate the individual from the broader context and study the thing in and itself in isolation. So, and you can take a billion examples of this. Think about just the nature of color, right? Like seeing, like having the experience of seeing the color red. We might think, well, that's just as pure as an observation gets, right? But really, says the holist, that's not true. What you're doing when you say, I see something red, is you're interpreting your visual, your perception within this context of everything you already think and know about culture and experience, like to come up with a color itself as something that you are oh, that's red that I'm seeing, is for you to have like these concepts around redness, around like distinguishing those sensations that you are calling red from other sensations that would be blue or purple. Like this, the sensation itself, says the holist, is not sort of like a pure experience independent of other theoretical or conceptual baggage that you bring to the picture. You need that stuff in place to make sense of what's going on for you. And what the holist says, there's got to be better examples, but I mean, what the holist says is all experience is like that. All knowledge is like that. Knowledge is contextual. We don't make statements about the world that are true or false in isolation from a broader context. We don't study the thing in and of itself in isolation, even when it comes down to a simple observation like solidity, right? When you touch a desk and you say that's solid, that experience itself is part of a way you already have of making sense of your experiences within a theoretical. Again, I should think of better examples. But that's the idea: is you can't study the world or make statements about it or really understand it without sort of a conceptual framework that you're applying to any and all experiences that you're having, right? Now, if this is true, then we would apply it like if you apply it to scientific testing, right? You can't test a single hypothesis in isolation. You can't do what the logical positivist wants you to do. You can't take a single sentence and then go, okay, this sentence is true or false on the basis of an observation, so we're just going to go test it. You can't do that. Rather, in order to get to that point where you're already making a statement about the world that's synthetic, a statement that you can test on the basis of observation, you have to have a complex network of claims and assumptions about the way the world is, that you are bringing to the table to do that simple observation. You have to have a bunch of claims that you believe about testing methods and about evidence and about your experiences themselves and how to interpret all of that. And without that, you can't do this basic observing and predicting, right? This is because a prediction about what you ought to observe is always the result of a network. So here's an example, right? Suppose we want to test an effective. Suppose we say something like an effective teacher is going to score highly on a teaching assessment. The truth of that sentence is tied into a bunch of theories that you bring to the table about what effective teaching is, about what the purpose of teaching is, about the measurability of effective teaching, and so on, right? Your test, likewise, is going to need to build in a bunch of quantifiable measures that are supposed to be measures of this concept that you have, the effectiveness of teaching, right? And so, and you also need to assume the student reports are a reliable guide to how effective a teacher is, and a billion other things, right? But every single one of those pieces of context need to be brought to the table in order for you to measure whether or not an effective teacher is scoring highly on a teaching assessment, right? So you can't just do a pure observation by itself. You've got to bring the theory to the table, and then that allows you to make your observation. Your text has a much more sciencey example about the association of high air pressure with stable weather patterns. But the basic idea here is take any scientific claim, right? It'll be part of a broader theoretical framework. And you have to, if you want to test that claim, you have to bring that theory to the table. And then it's only with that theory, about methods, about what the words, what the parts of the theory mean, like all of that theoretical framework together allows us to be in a position where we can say, okay, this experiment that we're doing is itself a test of this statement that's part of the theory. And without all that extra stuff, without all that other context, it's just impossible to do that, says the Hollist. But if Quine is right about this, right, well, then the logical positivist is has a problem, because they are saying, look, the way to test synthetic truths, which is basically what science is in the business of doing, is to go do experiments that'll, on the basis of those observations, we'll know whether or not a sentence is true or false. And Quine is saying, look, no, you can't do that, because in order to test the sentence itself, on the basis of an observation, you have to have a bunch of theoretical statements which themselves come to the table, and then all of that together bears on the basis of this thing you're testing, right? And so you're not ever getting to that pure observation verifying the truth of a sentence that the positivist demands, right? Now, if Quine is right, the logical positivist has to abandon that approach. At best, we have to replace it with a holistic model of empiricism, right? And by the time Quine was publishing, in practice, people had done this, right? There's very few sort of pure positivists around at the time. They had moved to a much, much more holistic picture of reasoning by the time he was around, right? The real problem was that in practice, the positivists would they would behave as if what they were doing was they were testing one sentence at a time, right? And that's so their official mantra was this kind of more pure logical positivism. Oh, you just get the synthetic truth and then you take it out and you observe something and that'll tell us whether or not it's true or false, even though they knew that, in reality they couldn't. That's not really what you would do, and the official method was much less strict, right? Quine's objection here is incredibly influential and contributes to a move away from the positive project towards a much weaker kind of empiricism. So if you're an empiricist post-Quine, you'll be what we would call a logical empiricist, right? And the logical empiricists, what they do is they abandon the verification principle that the positivists adopted, and they replace it with this much more holistic picture, right? They say theories themselves are these abstract structures, and they're built of a bunch of different hypotheses. And think about that. We talk about theoretical terms like gene or electron or soil, and the logical empiricist would say, and the Hollist would say, those things like a gene, that word only makes sense within a theory. It's a theoretical term. And now our observations about genes or about their behavior or about things that impact them are themselves predicated upon the theoretical structure that we're using. They're predicated upon our concepts of gene and the concepts surrounding that within our theoretical framework. So we're not ever describing private sensations, and we're not ever describing pure kind of observational statements about the way the world is, independent of theory, right? That's not what science is doing. That's not how humans live. Rather, what we're doing is we're describing science's descriptions of observable physical objects, and the sense-making itself of those observations is theoretical, right? And so we're in the business of getting like these experiences and then trying to make sense of them within a theoretical framework, and then using all that to kind of test the theoretical framework itself. So logical positivism runs into these two really deep problems, eventually abandoned, largely basically becomes replaced by logical empiricism. And then logical empiricism really people move away from that in like the 1960s, 1970s for the most part, changing views on the philosophy of language, changing pressure of holism, its failure to deal with inductive logics, which we'll talk about a little bit in class next week. Third chapter in your text goes into that. And then the growing significance of a lot of the social sciences, right? Things like psychology, the history of science, sociology of science, and the implications those approaches had for studying science itself. It just said there's so much that we can't really do by adopting this approach, and there's so much more going on with science that's just left off the table here. So that is logical positivism and logical empiricism that comes after it, right? So have a good one. See you next week. Okay. Reduce 2 hours to 30 minutes.